Great day in the morning. It's Nycos Session Zero Chronicles. Hi, I'm Jonathan Alvin, your host, and now we're on to our third attempt. There we go, and we are talking about episode 3. And today we're going to be looking at the species of Nycos. We're going to be dealing specifically with Quumple. And I said it right. Quumple, Quumple. And the Quumple are a segment of the fair folk of Nycos, and the fair folk are the most diminutive species available on the planet to play, and their height tops out at about 22 inches. Their normal height is around 18. And having it such a diminutive species makes for some both fun and challenging experiences. If you've played a halfling or a gnome in some games, many times you don't have the kind of difficulties that you would have being a Quumple because, for example, seating arrangements in restaurants and bars often is almost impossible, and so you're sitting instead on tankards or all kinds of fun things you do with it that normal adventuring encounters wouldn't necessarily do. So the Quumple, being such a tiny species, have their own sets of challenges, but they've also got some major advantages when it comes to things like even martial combat. They tend to be able to get into places where no one expected them, and such like, and therefore they get pretty good ambush qualities, that kind of thing, just from their nature. But in particular, the Quumple have a couple of distinctions. They originated as a segment of the gnome population in general, who, for the most part, abandoned their forested environments and moved closer into the barrens or the sandy places. Rocks and sand and debris, that's the living area, if you will, of the Quumple. They are pretty good scouts and navigators, so they tend to live in places that are pretty much abandoned by the others. Their homes are in two predominant areas of Nycos. They have found all across the Morgul steppes, and they're also found in the Mantaran wastes, two areas that are pretty much abandoned by everybody else. The irony is that places where everyone else feels out of sorts or out of place, these people particularly feel right at home. As a matter of fact, the Morgul steppes are a very high elevation. It's very near a desert in terms of atmosphere. Very dry, very arid, rough terrain, difficult to find shelters and stuff. And yet these the Quumples have just have a heck of a time up there. They are like their fairy brethren, they're the more fey brethren of the gnomes, in that they do have magical connections to the land and the soils, and their abilities therefore lend themselves to embracing their environment, do well in low water environments because they have natural abilities that let them get to resources better, and they also tend to utilize their animal companions in particularly useful ways, and we'll get more into that in a minute. So when we talk of the Morgul steppes, they are in the western half, if you will, of what most people know as Nordland. It is an area that is pretty much, if there's a shortcut on Nycos that will get you from one place to another, the Morgul steppes is about as far from that shortcut as possible. It's tucked up in the almost impassable regions of the Morgul steppes. what used to be known in previous iterations of Shonpru-A. And in that area, in addition to being sandy and desolate, it's one of the few places where there are populations of Ents still operating, but the Ents in this case are they're collectively known as the Old Joshuas, and it's literally desert terrain trees. These creatures thrive with low water, and they do take a long time to talk, as expected for a ant, perhaps. But the Old Joshuas are particularly sanguine and almost humorless. They have a very, pardon the French here, dry sense of humor, which is more than likely why I created them in the first place. Those areas that are parallel to this in climatological ways, the Mandarin wastes, are far to the west of in the northern reaches of Growlin. And the reason why the Mandarin wastes are appealing is that they are the opposite of the Morgul steppes. Mandarin wastes are literally the shortcut between Corum and the West countries. And so, therefore, people navigate through there in caravans and such. And some of the best guides that you could purchase in that area for discovering the ruins and such would be a Pumple. Now, out there in that desert somewhere is the original religious site known as the Mosque of Ahibad the Qumptal. And Ahibad was a third iteration character, which means it was a player who had originally created the name of Ahibad. And Ahibad was, of course, a reference to how awesome he actually was, because you say Ahibad. And if you understand the timing of the third iteration, Michael Jackson and a album having the words "I'm bad" on it were instrumental in the concept of Ahibad. And he was also unique in that he was the first person on Nycos to actually domesticate the alpacas of the area. And so he had a battle paca, and that battle paca was his steed. And he was also dedicated to the concept of becoming a member of an order of knights, and therefore constantly was running around with what was basically a long sharpened stick, but to him was his lance. And when I say long sharpened stick, it was maybe 6 feet long, but for him it was lance sized. So, and his battle cry throughout the entirety of his life, his signature was to scream, "Sing soprano sucka." This mosque, therefore, is said to be lost in the desert, and only the Pumples themselves can actually guide you there. Sometimes players and groups will stumble across it, but for the most part, it is undiscoverable for several reasons, including some of the magical effects that the stonemasons and the Qumples have made of it. Now, they're not particularly good at their stonework. They're nowhere near rivaling the dwarves, the Grundam, but on the other hand, they are also working in a very, very soft stone, so they learn how to work quickly to appreciate the work of their sculptures and carvings and such, and then they are lost in time because of the winds and weather in the very inhospitable places that they live. So, one of the other important points is that when you are traveling in the areas where you would find the Qumples, this is, you would think it would be as unlikely to find them as possible. but their entire population, including their uh, children, are all trained experts from a very early age in not being discovered. And so you could find yourself actually passing through an entire gnome village, a Quimple village, and not even know you'd pass through a place that was populated because they are all so good at pointed task of staying unrevealed. Now, I wanted to speak specifically of a fourth iteration Quimple, and his name was Sumdweeby, and Sumdweeby also had a battle packet. And one afternoon, they were accosted by a Eldrin airship, and the party that was with him decided that they were going to communicate with these Primus Eldrin and negotiated a meeting, and they were all going to be aboard the craft. And Zoom, of course, being a creature of the earth and very solidly, adamantly against this negotiation, crossed his arms and said he wouldn't go because he wasn't going to leave behind. If I remember, I don't have his name. I don't have the character sheet any longer for Zoom. It was donated by one of the players, but Zoom's battle pack, I think, was Bernice. I think that was her name. At any rate, they had to try to cajole Bernice to hold still long enough for them to get a harness around her to lift her onto the airship, and she was having none of that until they finally accomplished it. When they did finally get the netting wrapped around Bernice enough to get her airborne, she suddenly developed an affinity for it. She enjoyed the lofty elevation and such like. And so when they got aboard the vessel, you couldn't keep Bernice standing still. She was prancing around and running to the edge of the vessel. And poor Zoom, poor Zoom was so overwrought. He was, chasing her around and trying to keep her away from the edge, and yet she was clearly in her element. So they weren't sure what to do with her, so they decided to lock her in the hold. And that's kind of sad. You take somebody who's loving their environment and enjoying their sightseeing, and they're an animal, so they're not particularly you can't really communicate with them. So Bernice got put in the basement, put in the hold of the ship, in the forward hold, and while they were meeting, but a very precocious Bernice dug around until she found some of the emergency rations down below. And one of the emergency rations you would have on an airship, of course, would be a large quantity of a potion that provides featherfall. And so generally when you're on board, you would have your small flask of featherfall with you, so that should you fall overboard, you could save your life by quickly item exchanging, grabbing your flask of life-saving potion, and poof, you float to the ground safely. Well, she got into it and she drank a lot of it. It tasted okay, but more importantly, it was giving her kind of the willies. Well, when they finally came down to get her, she was a mess. She'd knocked over the vat. The fluid was all over the ground. The crew was frustrated and kind of annoyed, but they couldn't kind of understood. They had never had a wild animal loose inside of a hold before, so they weren't sure what would happen. So they had to clean everything up. And when they brought her aboard, brought her back to the deck, they found it surprising how easy it was to get her to get into the net, because she seemed almost anxious. But what they didn't count on is that once she got to the main deck, something happened within her physiognomy, and she developed there on the spot the ability to fly. Now, she became aware of it instantaneously. She could just feel. So she really settled down, and she was standing there placidly. They were still trying to figure out what they were going to do to get her down below because the uh, airship had moved from its original moorings, and so they were quite a bit farther aloft. And so they decided it was best to go ahead and have Zoom board mount his mighty steed, and then they would lower them together. So Zoom climbed into her saddle, and before anybody could respond, she catapulted towards the side of the deck. Now, this is not a fun situation for the poor player because he's not aware that she's going to have flight characteristics. All he knows is that she's heading for the edge and he can't fly. So he grabs a hold of Bernice's neck and says, shouts at her to stop, to put an end to her running. And I granted them a chance to make it on a die roll, which he subsequently failed. And so the mount and he went over the rail, and of course they vanished from line of sight from everybody on board the ship as they drop away. So everybody goes running to the edge to see where they are, and while they're looking, she has gotten her bearings and realized what she could do, and she navigated by basically making running actions in the air, and that allowed her to control her motive force. And so she took off at a gallop through the air under the vessel. She went under and came up around behind. So everybody's down below, and they're all standing on the railing, and they're all shouting at Ahibad, and at Zoom, asking him to drink his potion, save himself. Don't worry about the animal. Da da da. Well, when they were all along that railing, and the first of the players actually said, I really am going to miss Sum Tuibi. Bernice, hearing her master's name, bleated happily from behind them, and the sound of that animal's call required all of them to make an instantaneous saving throw, because they were, after all, overbalanced looking over the edge, and 3 out of the 5 party members that were with Zoom and Bernice failed. And fortunately, it was without incident, in that the players did have to make the challenging item interaction and drinking of the potion before they hit the ground, and one of them did it with less than 10 feet to go. So it was exciting and fun, but the point is that when they all got done, Zoom flew down to where they were, and as they were all starting to stand up and dust themselves off, he landed and said, "Anybody got a light?" Yeah, that's Zoom. All right, so wanted to also talk about the fact that this affinity for knighthood and chivalry led eventually to a series of tournaments that are held every year in Nycos, and they're not well known, so many iterations go by where no one actually attends them from an adventuring party group. But in the case of the Wilted Lists tournament, it's set up and established by whichever chieftain of the couples is in charge at that time, and he coordinates and sends away for the best of all the knights. And the only stipulation is they have to be less than 7 feet tall, less than 6 feet tall, less than 7 feet tall in the saddle. And the Wilted List tournament is actually held in a stony valley, and so the challenge is not only from your opponent along the lists. There is the barrier between them, but it's only about 12 inches tall, so it's not a real burden. But in addition to that, they have to worry about down hanging clumps of rock and roots that are growing from the soil that's above them, because the entire jousting list is basically a burrow in the ground, and so it makes for some fun adventures. So consider that as a possibility where you might want to go when you're visiting Nycos. And then another thing that I want to mention is, remember with the whole airship adventure, the couple have actually established a fairly good relationship with the Eldrin in histories since that fateful meeting. And to this day, there is a specially trained Marine unit detachment, if you will, that travels with one of the Eldrin fleets, and they are called the Shiny Squirrel Attack Force. And these are, as you may imagine, specially designed squirrel suits so that they look like, if you will, the little tiny flying squirrels. They're just so small, and their tail is actually their equipment pack. So as they ungainfully walk to the edge of the craft to leap, they do look very much like, say, World War II paratroopers carrying their own gear, and as they leap into the air, that gear pack falls out behind them, and their forward mass, leaning forward and raising their hands out in front of them, they give them the appearance of an entire squadron, if you will, of tiny attack squirrels. And the reason why they're called the shiny attack squirrels is that they have a predilection for valuables, and so as they dive towards their target, they have to roll resistance against going after the loot or cargo trains of their opponents, because they tend to be rather scavenger-like. And so, although they are a deadly military force, they are just as likely to end up robbing you blind as they are to actually fight you in a combat. But they are it's again a hysterical unit to be engaged with, as you might imagine. Now, the Quapple, with their tiny size and rather mischievous demeanor, aren't known for having an extremely effective impact on the iterations. They split off or splintered from the primary known population shortly before the establishment of the current capital of Havoc, and so they are more commonly related to what they call the dismay of the ages, which occurred in the sixth iteration, and fundamentally they stemmed the attack of the swarming in that time period simply by actually despoiling a band of land across their homeland, and thereby convincing the swarming Yarlum that there was no food to be had in that direction, and therefore turned the tide and saved their tiny nation from complete obliteration. Current iteration influences are considerably better, however, because of the fact that trade routes from Mantra through the Middle Kingdoms has become much more brisk with the breakup of the Koromite Empire. The tiny scouts are highly desired and are generally found in small sequestered groups within the populations of larger cities. I say sequestered because they do have a problem with people above their height. They tend to distrust anybody who is taller than they are. So when they get hired, it's usually for a considerable amount of money, and it's sufficiently high a fee that the persons that hire them generally are safe from them being turned against them or whatever. So this has been the Session Zero Chronicles, specifically talking about the Quapple, one of the 35 plus species that a player can choose to play in the world of Nycos. And I want to thank you for having been with us. If you like what you see, make sure you follow the channel and click the subscribe button if you're seeing this on YouTube, and we will catch you on the next episode. If you are with me on Twitch right now and wish to talk, just drop a chat line into the box and I'll remain for a few minutes after the show. But this is what I was attempting to record at this point. I do have my regularly scheduled Game Masters Soapbox, which will occur at 11 p.m. So if you don't catch me at this point, definitely drop by again at 11 p.m. tonight for Game Masters Soapbox. Thank you, and I'll talk to you later. Bye. Alrighty, so if you're in chat and you want to talk, feel free to drop a line. Otherwise, I'm going to sign out for a bit and get stuff prepared for the main show in a little more than an hour.